Trump tried to turn a black congresswoman into a prop on national television. Instead, a letter from a dying veteran in Mexico, 47 seconds of silence, and a single question about bone spurs would crack open his entire record on veterans, ICE, and the VA in front of 73 million people. Long before the country started replaying that silence in slow motion, the air inside CNN's Washington bureau felt thick enough to cut. Studio lights threw a relentless glare across the stage, baking through powder and hairspray. The makeup artist had already blotted Donald Trump's forehead twice in 10 minutes. But the shine kept returning, a visible reminder that even in carefully staged events, some things refused to stay under control. 5 minutes to air. Producers moved like choreographed panic. Headsets pressed tight, voices clipped and urgent. Every monitor in the control room flashed the same banner: America's Veterans, a national town hall. The network had promised a night of tough questions and unfiltered answers about the state of veteran care in the United States. In reality, this broadcast had been negotiated like a ceasefire. For weeks, the White House and CNN lawyers had haggled over seating arrangements, camera angles, question topics, even the order in which pre-selected audience members would be allowed to speak. None of that changed the simple fact that the stakes had never been higher. Reports about the Department of Veterans Affairs had been leaking out in scattered bursts for months. A delay here, a suicide there, a local story about a veteran dying while waiting for an appointment. Each piece was tragic, but compartmentalized, easy to frame as an isolated failure instead of a systemic collapse. Then a whistleblower inside VA headquarters released an internal memo, and the quiet drip turned into a flood. 83,000 jobs. The document described a workforce restructuring initiative, so massive it might as well have been labeled an evacuation order. Cuts across hospitals, clinics, call centers, suicide hotlines, numbers that looked cold and abstract until you attached them to real people. A nurse in Pittsburgh, a social worker in Phoenix, a psychiatrist in El Paso. A full 17% of the VA workforce targeted for elimination in the name of efficiency. The memo landed on front pages and led every evening broadcast. Veterans groups that had stayed loyal through previous scandals suddenly found their patience exhausted. Even Republican lawmakers who usually swallowed controversy in silence began to issue statements that sounded dangerously close to dissent. In Washington, that kind of noise might as well be a fire alarm. The White House responded with its standard damage control play. Donald Trump would appear in a friendly format, insist that no one in history had cared more about veterans than he did, announce some cosmetic initiative, and rely on sheer force of personality to smother the story. It was a strategy that had worked more times than it had any right to. Campaign rallies, debates, press conferences, Trump had treated them all like stages, and he had rarely walked off one looking like the loser. This night, his team expected more of the same. What they did not account for was Jasmine Crockett. On the stage, the geometry of power had been negotiated down to the inch. Anderson Cooper sat at center with a stack of notes and an expression that blended professionalism with something heavier. To Cooper's left, in a slightly elevated chair demanded by his advanced staff, sat Donald J. Trump in a navy suit, red tie perfectly knotted, posture carefully arranged to project dominance. The extra 2 inches of height weren't an accident, they were part of the armor. To Cooper's right, in a standard chair and a simple dark suit, sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas's 30th District, former civil rights attorney, former public defender, now a freshman member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. In a town that worshipped seniority, she was supposed to be ornamental, visible diversity, controllable opposition. On her lap rested a black leather portfolio. The clasp remained closed. Off stage, an aide leaned toward Trump for one last whispered briefing. His phone had not stopped vibrating for over an hour. Messages from the chief of staff, the VA secretary, political operatives across Washington, all repeating the same anxious warning. Crockett was prepared. Crockett had documents. Crockett was not coming to play her assigned role. Trump barely glanced at the phone. For him, television was a sport he had never lost. He had survived debates, ambush interviews, hostile town halls. A black freshman congresswoman from Texas did not register as a threat. 30 seconds. The audience settled into a loaded silence. Veterans filled most of the seats, some in suits, some in worn jeans, some in jackets decorated with rows of ribbons and pins. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Coast Guard. Older faces lined by decades of fatigue. Younger faces carrying the hard stare of recent wars. Beside them sat spouses, parents, children, people whose lives had been measured out in deployments, homecomings, folded flags. For some, this town hall was another political show. For others, it was a last attempt to understand why the country that had promised to care for them or their loved ones seemed intent on pulling the safety net out from under their feet. 10 seconds. Anderson Cooper straightened his tie. Jasmine Crockett uncapped her pen and drew a small line on an otherwise blank legal pad. Anchoring herself in ink, Donald Trump flashed his familiar stage smile. The one that had carried him through rallies and scandals alike. The red light above the main camera flared to life. America was watching. Cooper opened the program with the ritual introduction, welcoming viewers to CNN's Washington bureau and framing the night's focus, veteran care. Its successes and failures, and the policies shaping their future. His tone was measured, but the words carried a different charge now. The leaked memo, the staff cuts, the suicides, none of it could be treated as background noise anymore. He introduced Donald Trump as the president responsible for the current direction of the VA. He introduced Jasmine Crockett as a key member of the committee charged with oversight. Trump nodded politely and projected affection for veterans, leaning heavily on familiar phrases about strength, sacrifice, and gratitude. Crockett offered a simple acknowledgement. Nothing more. She had not come to compete for stage time. She had come to lay out a case. Before turning to either of them for a substantive answer, Cooper signaled the control room. The main screen behind the stage flickered and filled with the image of a younger man in an army dress uniform circa 1972. Medals shining against a pressed jacket. Eyes full of pride. Mario Oruro Moreno. Cooper narrated Mario Moreno's life as if reading a charge sheet against the system itself. 8 years of service in the United States Army. Duty in Germany during the Cold War. An honorable discharge. 4 decades in California. Raising 3 children. Paying taxes. Building a quiet, ordinary life that should have culminated in peaceful retirement. Instead, the second photograph told a different story. An elderly man, gaunt and exhausted, stood in front of a weathered house with cracked plaster and peeling paint in Juarez, Mexico. Deported in 2019 for a long-past criminal conviction he had already served time for. Shipped across the border at 73. Stripped of the legal right to reside in the nation he had once sworn to defend. 3 weeks before the town hall, Mario Moreno's appendix ruptured. The timeline that followed had been verified and re-verified by producers until every detail felt like a verdict. A daughter, an American citizen, scrambled to arrange ambulances on both sides of the border. A VA hospital in El Paso prepared to receive him and confirmed capacity. All that was required was permission to cross for emergency medical care. The Department of Homeland Security refused. The denial language dripped with bureaucratic chill, describing humanitarian entry for a deported veteran as a discretionary, extraordinary measure to be used sparingly. While lawyers haggled and agencies shuffled responsibility, Mario Moreno gasped his way through sepsis in a Mexican hospital bed. He died 2 days later, never allowed to set foot on the soil he had once defended under orders. The next image on the screen was a military cemetery, Fort Bliss National Cemetery. Rows of identical white stones receding toward the horizon. Mario Moreno's ashes, unlike his living body, had been granted entry. He was buried with full military honors beneath a perfectly trimmed lawn. Eulogized by a flag he no longer possessed the right to live under. In the studio, a soft sound broke the silence, a stifled sob from the audience. No one moved to comfort the source. The grief felt too collective, too shared, to be interrupted. Cooper finished the story by invoking Mario's daughter, Valeria, and the remarks she had made at her father's memorial. Words about how a country could bar a living veteran and welcome only his remains. Words about feeling as if her father's life had been weighed, measured, and found expendable until death polished him into something acceptable again. Then Cooper turned toward Donald Trump and laid out the core question in precise, unflinching terms. Mario Moreno had served. He had aged. He had needed emergency care that the VA was willing to provide. The administration had blocked his path. The national audience awaited a reason. Trump's instincts activated immediately. His hands moved in familiar arcs, sculpting the air in front of him, framing the narrative as he wished it to be seen. The telltale rhythm of deflection began. Acknowledgement of a sad story. Invocation of borders and laws. Insistence that deportations had reasons that could not be ignored. He leaned on his greatest hits, claims of unprecedented achievements for veterans. References to legislation passed, to bureaucratic reforms, to supposed love from the veteran community itself. Even his rebuttal contained an attack vector. He pivoted toward Jasmine Crockett, recasting her professional history as a public defender into an implied betrayal of victims and soldiers. In his framing, she had spent her career defending criminals, while others fought overseas. He painted her district as a landscape of crime and disorder. Her service as a legislator as a mere platform to attack him rather than fix the community that had elected her. Crockett did not respond immediately. She wrote 3 small words on her legal pad and let the attack wash past her like a wave hitting rock. Her gaze remained on her notes, not on the man attempting to use her as a shield against an unanswerable story. Trump finished his performance with the smug composure of someone who believed he had once again seized control of the stage. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then Jasmine Crockett placed her pen carefully across her pad, lifted the black portfolio from her lap, and opened the clasp. The faint metallic click carried across the studio like the sound of something chambering into place. She began not with opinion, but with ancestry, a brief acknowledgement of a grandfather who had stormed Normandy and earned a Purple Heart at 19. A man who had taught her that patriotism was measured not in self-praise but in service to others. It was not sentimentality, it was a foundation. From there, she moved to evidence. An internal VA memorandum dated February 2025, stamped with official letterhead, describing in clinical language the elimination of 83,000 positions. A VA Inspector General's report cataloging severe staffing shortages in 98% of VA medical centers even before those cuts took effect. Documentation of 66,000 existing vacancies, unfilled because the agency had become a place where talented professionals feared instability and political interference. Her voice remained calm, but each statistic felt like a hammer strike against the facade carefully built around Trump's claims. Efficiency, she argued, was the word politicians used when they wanted to make abandonment sound respectable. Around them, the audience shifted. A veteran in the front row, a silver star pinned to his jacket, nodded with slow, grim familiarity. He did not need a memo to tell him what understaffing looked like. He had seen it in waiting rooms and rescheduled appointments. Crockett's documents escalated. An email obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request from doctors warning headquarters that funding cuts were halting cancer trials for more than 1,000 veterans. A graph from the VA's own annual report showing that while suicide prevention funding stagnated or dropped, the rate of veteran suicide remained brutally steady at more than 17 deaths a day, one every 82 minutes. She forced the timeline into the present, during the time Trump had occupied his chair under the hot studio lights. Multiple veterans somewhere in America had taken their own lives. The number did not care about ratings. As charts and memos accumulated, Trump's complexion moved from pink to red. The familiar counterattack pattern surfaced. Accusations of fake news, denial of data, paranoid references to a deep state arrayed against him. He tried to drown out documents with volume. Crockett never raised her voice. She simply kept turning pages. The Veterans Crisis Line and its loss of hundreds of staff. The appointment of Doug Collins, a loyalist with no meaningful healthcare or VA experience, as secretary. The leak of a handwritten note urging him to fix the story, not the problem, and to announce something dramatic before July 4th. When she held up that single sheet of paper and asked whether the handwriting on it belonged to the president, the control room recognized the moment and zoomed in. Viewers at home could see every loop, every flourish. The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Trump opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Those watching at home would later describe those silent seconds as the first crack in a dam. In the studio, they felt like a change in weather, pressure dropping, storm building, something huge and inevitable drawing closer. Crockett did not wait for an answer that would never come. She laid the note down, turned to a new set of pages in her portfolio, and shifted the focus from hospital corridors and backlogged claims to a different frontier where veterans and immigrants collided, the border itself. The story of Mario Moreno had been the opening salvo. Now came the broader indictment. Part 1 ended there, with a black congresswoman standing on a national stage, her portfolio open, her evidence spread out like a case file against the administration, and a president who had never lost a televised confrontation staring at documents he could not shout into submission. The most brutal 47 seconds in modern political television were still ahead. Trump had walked into the town hall expecting a skirmish. Jasmine Crockett had come with a prosecution. The first wave had been the VA cuts, 83,000 jobs. Gutted suicide hotlines, hollowed out oncology programs. It was enough to shake the illusion that everything at the VA was better than ever. But Crockett had not opened that black portfolio just to talk about wait times and staffing charts. The pages waiting underneath the memos told a darker story. One that stretched from VA hospitals to detention cells and border crossings. From veterans' clinics to deportation buses. The control room watched as the camera framed her at a slightly tighter angle. The audience could not see the producers leaning toward their monitors. But the tension translated all the same. This was no longer a debate over management. This was an indictment of what a country chooses to do with the people who once wore its uniform. Crockett shifted the focus with a single pivot. What happens when a veteran is no longer useful in the eyes of the system? The screen behind them changed again. This time not to Mario Moreno's face, but to a faded photograph of a group of men in jungle fatigues. Young and exhausted, caught mid-laughter in some forgotten clearing in Vietnam. One figure was circled in red. Later, viewers would replay the image, pause on the face, and remember the name that followed. Sergeant First Class David Nguyen. Crockett narrated his trajectory the same way Cooper had handled Mario Moreno's, as an unbroken line from service to abandonment. 3 combat tours in Vietnam, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, shrapnel lodged permanently in muscle and bone, nightmares that ripped him awake for decades. Early years dismissed as weakness and moral failure before the term PTSD ever appeared in a medical manual. He self-medicated, like so many veterans who were told to man up rather than seek help. A drinking problem turned into a DUI. One charge in 73 years of life. One mistake in a life defined by battlefield scars. The screen cut to another image. An older man sitting on a narrow bed in a bare room. Foreign signage visible through a barred window. No family photos. No flags. Just the washed-out light of a place he did not know. David Nguyen in Vietnam. Deported in 2019. He had left that country as a child. Barely old enough to remember its streets. He had returned in chains. Speaking little of the language. With no family network. No VA clinic. No familiar church. No community to catch him. A lifetime spent in the United States had been reduced to a file folder and a bus ride. Crockett pulled a creased letter from her portfolio. The paper looked tired, worn at the folds, the way documents look when they are opened and closed by hands that are running out of time. The audience watched as she described its journey, from a detention center in Vietnam to a mailbox in America. To the envelope her staff had received from a grieving daughter. The phrases inside that letter cut deeper than any statistic. The admission that diabetes was getting worse without VA care. The attempt to navigate a foreign system with no translator. The repeated efforts to obtain permission to return for treatment. The quiet conviction that 22 years of service ought to mean something. The final plea to have his grandchildren told that their grandfather had been a soldier. That he had tried. By the time Crockett reached the final line, an apology for not making it home, some members of the audience were no longer merely listening. They were bracing, as if each word might physically land. David Nguyen had died in a hospital half a world away. His body, like Mario Moreno's, had been allowed to cross the border only when it no longer contained a living veteran. The pattern was becoming harder to dismiss as coincidence. Crockett widened the lens again, setting individual stories inside a stark framework. A report from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, an estimated 94,000 veterans living in the United States without citizenship. Men and women who had worn the uniform, sworn the oath, marched under the flag, and yet remained a paperwork error away from exile. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, she reminded the country, did not even track veteran status as a matter of policy. When someone was deported, the system recorded their name, their case number, their alleged violation, but not whether they had ever carried a rifle for the United States or watched a friend bleed out on foreign soil. The government, by design or neglect, had made veterans invisible at the exact moment their status should have mattered most. On the stage, Trump attempted to fall back on familiar terrain. Talk of criminals, of bad hombres, of law and order. He tried to draw a thick line between worthy and unworthy, between soldier and suspect, between patriot and problem, the rhetoric that usually fueled rallies, crafted to make deportations sound like a security strategy rather than a human choice. But Crockett no longer allowed him room to build the narrative. She repeatedly dragged the conversation back to the fact that these deportations often involved people who had already served their sentences. Veterans who had completed their punishment, only to discover that a missing citizenship certificate turned a decades-old conviction into a life sentence of exile. The only difference between them and thousands of other veterans with similar records was an unresolved bureaucratic promise. The audience shifted again. For some veterans in the audience, this climate of conditional belonging felt like a mirror. A handful had green cards sitting in their pockets instead of citizenship documents. Some knew friends or comrades who had enlisted believing their service would automatically grant them full membership in the nation they fought for. Crockett's evidence made clear how thin that promise could be. The narrative then flicked sideways to a cramped building in Tijuana, the Deported Veterans Support House. A place where men like Mario Moreno and David Nuon might have ended up if they had survived long enough. Crockett described it not as a shelter but as a limbo. A place where discarded soldiers tried to stitch together some semblance of life with limited medicine, limited money, and unlimited memories of a country that refused to acknowledge them. Even viewers who had never heard of such a place before felt the weight of its existence. A house across a border dedicated to those who had once been willing to die defending the other side of that line. Then came the pivot that linked VA cuts, deported veterans, and ICE together in a single damning equation: the direction of the money. A new chart filled the screen, two columns facing off like opposing sides in a war. On one side, reductions in VA mental health services, oncology funding, and suicide prevention outreach. On the other, increased budgets for detention facility construction, immigration enforcement patrols, and operational expansions. It was not an accident. It was a reallocation, deliberate and documented. In Crockett's framing, every dollar that vanished from veteran care and reappeared in the ICE budget was not a neutral accounting decision. It was a choice about who deserved life-saving treatment and who deserved a cage. She walked through the numbers with surgical precision. Hundreds of millions slashed from VA mental health programs. Cuts to cancer research that had already been linked to the cancellation of trials. Reductions in suicide outreach materials and staff. Then, line by line, the corresponding surges in ICE funding, billions poured into detention infrastructure and enforcement operations. The conclusion she built was inescapable. A government claiming to honor veterans was choosing to fund more beds for detainees while leaving veterans to fight tooth and nail for their own care. Trump's attempts to reframe the issue around border security began to sound increasingly hollow against the specificity of her evidence. When he invoked threats, Crockett countered with Department of Homeland Security data showing that the overwhelming majority of those detained by ICE had no violent criminal record. Charts and internal memos painted a picture of a system incentivized to maximize bodies in detention rather than carefully target threats. The comparison that followed left the room colder. Crockett drew a line between historic systems of enforcement and the modern architecture of immigration control, not through rhetoric alone, but through language. Old statutes empowering slave patrols to seize suspected fugitives based on appearance and location. Modern ICE guidelines authorizing detention based on reasonable indicators, like language and physical features. The words might have evolved. The logic had not. By the time she finished, the town hall no longer felt like a standard network event. It resembled a courtroom where the usual defense strategies, bluster, deflection, personal attacks, had been rendered useless by the volume and clarity of the evidence. Veterans in the audience, some of whom had shown up expecting a typical partisan spectacle, now sat with arms crossed and jaws clenched, processing the uncomfortable truth that the government they had served was balancing its books by stripping services from them and weaponizing enforcement against people who looked like their neighbors, spouses, or even themselves. Trump still occupied the elevated chair, but the height advantage had stopped mattering. The nation could feel it. The confrontation was no longer about one memo or one veteran's death. It had become a referendum on what kind of country America was willing to be, and what would happen when the most sheltered man in that country was finally forced to answer to those who had bled for it. The 47 seconds that would haunt him had yet to arrive. But the ground beneath him was already starting to give way. By the time the audience absorbed the implications of Crockett's evidence on VA cuts, deported veterans, and enforcement budgets, a shift had already begun. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slow, seismic movement that happens when an entire room realizes the ground beneath them has been sanded thinner than they believed. Veterans who had arrived expecting a predictable political brawl began leaning forward in their seats. Cooper's posture tightened. Even the camera operators, who had been professionally stoic through countless broadcasts, found themselves glancing up from their monitors as though instinctively aware that something unprecedented was unfolding. The tension no longer came from the debate between two political figures. It came from the collision between lived reality and official narratives. A collision so violent that the stage lights themselves felt complicit for illuminating it. Crockett exposed personal tragedies: Mario Moreno's death at the border, David Nuon's final letter, 94,000 non-citizen veterans whose service was dismissed as a clerical footnote. Those stories alone could have sparked a congressional hearing, a documentary, a national outcry. But she hadn't come to expose tragedies. She had come to expose structure. What emerged next was no longer about isolated failures. It was about the machinery that produced those failures with the consistency of a factory line. And as she revealed each layer, a picture formed of a system engineered not simply to fail veterans, but to fail them in ways that could be erased, rationalized, or rebranded as necessary collateral. The screen behind them shifted again, this time to a montage of images captured at ICE detention centers: fluorescent-lit corridors, bare concrete floors, caged recreation pens, rows of metal bunks stacked 3 high. Crockett described these places with a precision that made them feel less like holding facilities and more like pressure chambers built to crush the humanity out of anyone caught inside. The pages she lifted showed internal reports cataloging deaths in custody, many of them preventable, many of them dismissed as non-critical events in official summaries. Then came the number that silenced even the most hardened skeptics: 23 deaths in ICE custody in the current year alone, the highest since 2004. The causes varied: medical neglect, suicide, untreated infections, sudden collapses, but the pattern was unmistakable. The conditions were not accidents. They were features. Veterans watching at home knew the look of systemic neglect. They had spent years inside overcrowded clinics, fought battles with claims adjusters, navigated labyrinthine appeals processes that seemed designed to break them down before help arrived. The idea that the government could replicate the same neglect inside detention centers was not surprising. It was horrifying precisely because it felt familiar. Crockett moved methodically through documentation detailing solitary confinement placements. 10,000 individuals in 14 months. Some held for days, some for weeks, some for long enough to experience lasting psychological trauma. Veterans in the audience exchanged guarded looks. Some had spent years listening to fellow soldiers describe the mental collapse triggered by isolation in wartime prisons. The parallels were impossible to ignore. But the most disturbing connection came when Crockett laid out the funding trails. In stark, unemotional language, Federal documents revealed how every reduction to veteran mental health resources corresponded with an expansion in ICE enforcement operations. Suicide prevention staff eliminated, crisis hotline positions slashed, funding for PTSD treatment cut to a fraction of what experts recommended. And on the opposite ledger, detention beds added, transfer contracts expanded, private vendors rewarded for each human body counted inside a facility. The arithmetic was as brutal as it was undeniable. Veterans lost care so detention centers could gain capacity. Trump tried to reassert dominance with the same tactics that had served him in the past: grand proclamations about accomplishments, finger-pointing at political opponents, invocations of patriotism. But Crockett's evidence made those declarations sound like echoes in a collapsing hallway. She had turned the conversation into a referendum on the nation's values. And he no longer controlled the terms. Then she made the pivot that changed the temperature of the room entirely, connecting the VA cuts and ICE expansion to a broader historical lineage. Crockett reached back into American legal history, not for rhetorical flourish, but to demonstrate continuity. Statutes that once empowered slave patrols to detain black Americans based on suspicion, appearance, and location. Laws that had given broad discretionary power to enforce eligibility for freedom. Records of systems that treated human beings as variables to be managed rather than citizens to be served. Modern ICE guidelines appeared alongside those old texts. And the language, scrubbed with bureaucratic polish, echoed the same logic. Apprehension based on indicators of origin, speech, or presence in designated zones. The audience did not need Crockett to say the words. They could feel the lineage themselves. The way language evolves while power structures remain startlingly intact. Veterans who had fought dictatorship overseas found themselves staring at practices that looked uncomfortably similar to the authoritarian tactics they had once been told set America apart from other nations. Men who had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam had not expected their own government to use detention quotas, appearance-based targeting, and prolonged isolation as ordinary tools of enforcement. The juxtaposition sickened them. But Crockett was not finished. She expanded the scope even further, exposing the internal incentive system that turned detention into a business model. Private corporations contracted to run facilities were paid per detainee per night, a metric that guaranteed profit only when human beings were kept behind bars. The reports she held showed emails discussing capacity optimization, occupancy targets, and cost efficiency strategies. Cold corporate language masking the human suffering beneath it. This was no longer a story about deported veterans or a dying man at a border crossing. It was about a government apparatus whose financial incentives rewarded mass detention while stripping essential services from those who had earned them through service and blood. Cooper's expression tightened. Trump's posture stiffened. Crockett's calm intensity only grew sharper. The audience could sense what was coming. She had drawn a circle around a system that punished vulnerability, monetized suffering, and abandoned those who had once stood between danger and their nation. And now she was ready to walk through the center of it. Ended with Crockett lifting a final sheet of paper, one that had been withheld until the exact moment it would have maximum impact. A sheet that contained numbers so grotesque, so revealing, that even the producers braced themselves in silence. Because in the next segment, Crockett would expose not only what had been cut, diverted, or mismanaged, but who had knowingly signed off on it, why they had done so, and how far up the chain the decisions went. The portfolio was open. The system was on trial. And the president sitting under the lights had nowhere left to look but straight into the evidence bearing his administration's seal. From the moment Jasmine Crockett lifted that final sheet of paper in Part 3, the tenor of the town hall changed. Until then, the confrontation had felt like a meticulously crafted exchange, a clash of narratives, evidence, and political power. But now a new energy took hold. The kind that permeates only moments before a structure collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. It wasn't just the studio audience sensing it. People watching from their living rooms felt the air shift as though the transmission itself carried the tremor. What Crockett revealed next was not a statistic or a tragic anecdote. It was the blueprint of a plan, the kind that can only exist when a system expects no one to question it. The document contained language clinical in tone, administrative in formatting, but devastating in implication. It described a coordinated approach to manipulating VA performance numbers by narrowing eligibility criteria, accelerating denials, and pushing unresolved cases into bureaucratic limbo where they would not appear on public reports. The memo spoke of timelines, optics, and narrative stabilization, the euphemisms of a government bent not on solving problems but on hiding them. Veterans in the audience recognized the pattern instantly. They had lived it. They had waited on hold for hours, resubmitted paperwork multiple times, recited their trauma to rotating staff who never stayed long enough to understand the whole story. For them, the memo wasn't a revelation, only confirmation. Crockett let the weight of the document settle before presenting the next piece, a schedule of weekly briefings between senior officials and political advisors. Each entry carried annotations about strategic messaging, media vulnerabilities, and mitigation priorities. Not a single bullet point referenced the veterans whose lives depended on the decisions being made in those rooms. The camera captured Trump's posture tightening, his hands gripping the armrests of his elevated chair. His team often believed he thrived in chaos. But this was a different kind of chaos, one in which every attempt to redirect, dismiss, or overwhelm was met with evidence that refused to bend. Crockett continued. She unveiled charts showing spikes in processing rejections that coincided exactly with political deadlines. She opened emails from administrators expressing concern that they were being asked to optimize numbers instead of improve care. She highlighted whistleblower notes warning that veterans suffering from PTSD, cancer, and traumatic brain injuries were being placed into appeals processes so overloaded they might as well have been open graves. Some audience members visibly recoiled at that last detail. A Marine in the third row clenched his jaw so tightly the muscles twitched. A woman holding a framed photograph of her son pressed the glass to her chest. Crockett shifted seamlessly to the next exhibit, a binder tabbed in red. Inside were internal cost analyses comparing spending between veteran care and immigration detention. The numbers left no ambiguity. Cuts at the VA were not isolated cost-saving measures. They were paired, deliberately, systematically, with surges in ICE funding. It was not one budget being reduced and another growing independently. It was a transfer. The implication was unmistakable. Veteran services were being stripped so the administration could finance an expanded detention apparatus. The studio fell into a silence so complete that the hum of overhead lights became audible. Cooper, normally master of the measured transition, did not interrupt. Producers in the control room watched with suspended breath as Crockett laid out the final comparisons: hospital closures and detention expansions, suicide line staff reductions and new surveillance contracts, oncology cuts and construction of additional holding facilities. The columns aligned like two sides of a ledger documenting a moral bankruptcy. Crockett then reached for a different kind of document, one written not by bureaucrats, but by those caught inside the detention system. Reports from physicians, social workers, and compliance monitors. Accounts of detainees denied basic medical assessments, of individuals with chronic conditions left untreated, of mental health crises met with isolation instead of intervention. One report described a facility where detainees were given a single cup of rice per day. Another documented a wing where 35 men shared a single open toilet with no privacy partition. A third detailed children housed in temperatures so extreme they developed respiratory issues. And then, the most damning part, internal correspondence acknowledging that the administration had been warned repeatedly about the conditions and had chosen not to intervene. Veterans in the audience, who had spent years fighting against their own government's neglect, recognized the institutional callousness instantly. They had seen the same resistance in disability claims, the same evasion in appeals, the same inertia in scheduling. The machinery that ignored detainees was the same machinery that ignored them. It had simply found a new population to fail. Trump attempted a pivot, an assertion about border crises and national security, but the timing was wrong. Crockett had evidence ready before the words even fully left his lips. DHS records showing that the majority of those detained had no criminal convictions. Memos indicating that detention quotas had been reintroduced informally through performance expectations. Statistics showing that enforcement had become driven by numbers, not threats. As the evidence piled higher, viewers across the country began experiencing something rare in modern politics: clarity. This was not partisan theater. This was a confrontation between a system that had grown comfortable with secrecy and a legislator who had decided to drag its workings into national light. Then came the final element that made the country's breath catch: Crockett's introduction of whistleblower audio. The studio froze as she prepared the playback device. Producers exchanged frantic glances. Secret Service agents shifted positions. Trump's aide went pale. The audience leaned forward like a single organism. No one knew what the recording contained. But Crockett did. The recording that filled the studio, a senior official discussing backlog manipulation, approval, targets, and political deadlines, hit like an explosive charge. It revealed not incompetence, not negligence, but intent. Trump's reaction was instant and visceral. He rose abruptly, attempting to retake the narrative by sheer force. But the momentum had already shifted beyond recovery. The audience did not recoil from Crockett. They recoiled from him. In that moment, the town hall ceased being a political event and became something else entirely: a reckoning. Live and unedited, broadcast to tens of millions. Crockett had crossed a threshold that few lawmakers ever reach. She had shifted the burden from proving wrongdoing to forcing the nation to confront what it already believed but had never seen laid bare in such forensic detail. Veterans across the room felt it. Viewers at home felt it. Even Cooper felt it, the way an anchor senses when a broadcast has moved from reporting news to making history. The whistleblower recording settled over the town hall like a detonator. It exposed a decision-making culture where metrics mattered more than veterans' lives. Where political deadlines replaced medical urgency. And where bureaucrats discussed human suffering as paperwork to be managed. The recording stripped away every layer of spin, leaving only intent, and that intent was damning. The audience felt the shift instantly. Veterans who had endured years of denials and delays recognized the machinery and the recording. Families who had buried service members saw the familiar indifference that had carved holes into their lives. Even the stage lighting seemed to dim under the weight of what had been revealed. Trump stood, visibly rattled. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a performer and more like a man boxed in by facts he could not outtalk. He had built a political identity on dominance, interrupting, deriding, overpowering, but Crockett had reduced that arsenal to silence with a single piece of evidence. Crockett, still composed, placed the device down and let the quiet work. Her posture communicated what her words did not need to. The country had finally heard what veterans had been living with for years. Then came the question, the one she posed with no raised voice. No dramatic flourish. A question pulling together every memo, every chart, every death in custody, every deported veteran, every cut to cancer trials, every suicide left unprevented. A question that demanded not justification, but accountability. The room froze. Trump opened his mouth. No sound followed. 47 seconds. 47 seconds in which 73 million viewers watched the most powerful officeholder in the nation grasp for a response to evidence that pierced directly through rhetoric and branding. The silence became its own verdict, a public acknowledgement that the system had been exposed and that those responsible had no defense prepared for this kind of reckoning. Veterans in the audience exchanged looks not of triumph, but recognition. They had known this truth long before the cameras captured it. Now everyone else knew it too. When Trump finally forced out words, the force of the silence had already done the irreversible. His response felt thin, disconnected from the gravity of what had been shown. The narrative had slipped out of his hands. The presidency's aura could not override the evidence now circulating through every timeline, every living room, every conscience. Crockett allowed the moment to settle. She had not sought spectacle. She had sought clarity. And the nation had received it, not through shouting or theatrics, but through the unmistakable sound of a leader confronted by the consequences of his own decisions and finding nothing to say. This was the turning point, not because of what was spoken, but because of what wasn't. A silence that revealed everything. A silence that veterans understood better than anyone. A silence that would echo far beyond a single broadcast, reshaping the conversation about who this country claims to honor and who it actually protects. The 47 seconds of silence did not end when the broadcast cut to commercial. They rippled outward, into living rooms, base housing units, VFW halls, VA waiting rooms, and every digital platform capable of replaying the moment. The silence became a mirror, reflecting a truth veterans had long suspected: their suffering had been managed, not solved. Within minutes, clips from the town hall flooded social media. The recording of the senior official discussing backlog manipulation circulated alongside graphs of VA cuts, photos of detention conditions, and the stories of deported veterans whose names had flickered across the screen. Each piece formed a mosaic that made the original political narrative impossible to defend. Veterans organizations reacted first. Statements emerged with unusual speed and unusual unity. Groups with decades of political neutrality now called for emergency oversight. Some demanded resignations. Others called for congressional investigations into the restructuring plan revealed by Crockett. What had been rumors and whispers became actionable outrage. Military families mobilized next. Parents of active duty soldiers, spouses of deployed service members, and caregivers of wounded veterans organized online in a wave of grassroots fury. Their posts were not partisan. They were personal. Photos of loved ones, stories about denied claims, screenshots of appointment delays, snapshots of medication refill rejections. As the commentary poured out, the scale of the problem became impossible to portray as isolated. Even inside the VA system, tremors spread. Frontline staff, overworked physicians, exhausted administrative workers, social workers who had been drowning in caseloads, began leaking documents, emails, staffing charts, internal warnings. The town hall had opened a gate that could no longer be closed. The truth that had lived in filing cabinets and restricted access drives now spilled into public view. ICE officers, too, reacted. Some anonymously defended their work. Others quietly confirmed Crockett's claims, speaking of quotas, overcrowded cells, and instructions that contradicted their training. Former agents recounted resignations caused by moral injury. The internal fracture became visible. On Capitol Hill, the shock was immediate and disorienting. Senior lawmakers called emergency caucus meetings. Staffers scrambled to draft statements distancing themselves from the exposed policies. Lobbyists who had spent years shaping immigration and VA priorities moved swiftly to reorient their messaging. The silence that had humiliated the president became the pressure point for a political realignment few had anticipated. But the most profound reaction came from ordinary Americans who had never served. For them, the broadcast was not just a revelation. It was a gut check. They saw veterans, people taught to endure anything, describe a system that had broken them. They saw families begging for medical care across borders. They saw detention centers where neglect was packaged as policy. The moral line was suddenly clear. And in the days following the town hall, the silence became a rallying cry. More powerful than any speech. More revealing than any leaked memo. A moment where truth stood alone. And the country could see who was willing to face it, and who couldn't. In the 48 hours following the town hall, Washington operated like a breached engine, noisy, overheated, and impossible to stabilize. The administration attempted rapid containment. But every move triggered a louder aftershock. The president's senior staff convened emergency calls that leaked within minutes. Drafted talking points contradicted one another. Advisors circulated memos insisting the town hall had been a media ambush. Yet none addressed the documents Crockett displayed on air. Confusion metastasized into panic as agencies scrambled to determine which files might surface next. Inside the VA, the fallout was immediate. Regional directors received frantic directives to review communication protocols, a euphemism for damage control. Frontline employees, emboldened by Crockett's revelations, began quietly sharing screenshots of internal dashboards showing unrealistic performance targets and denial quotas. Middle managers, long pressured to massage numbers, suddenly feared the spotlights shifting their way. ICE headquarters saw similar fractures. Supervisors fielded calls from field offices where agents asked whether the quota system, previously understood as unofficial, would be formally disavowed. Others requested guidance on handling press inquiries. A few asked bluntly whether certain orders would expose them to legal risk. The chain of command offered no reassurance. Congress responded with political instinct, motion. Committees announced hearings. Investigators requested briefings. Staffers drafted subpoenas before leadership even confirmed next steps. The machine of oversight, dormant for years, reactivated in a surge of self-preservation and genuine outrage. But the most destabilizing force came not from institutions, but from the people they had failed. Veterans staged sit-ins at VA hospitals across 6 states. Some arrived in wheelchairs, others with prosthetics, others with service dogs. They planted themselves in lobbies and corridors, refusing to leave until they received commitments that frontline staff would not be fired to cover budget gaps. Their presence became impossible to ignore. Families who had lost relatives to suicide posted photos of last messages. Empty uniforms, folded flags, their grief cut through political divides, drawing empathy from viewers who had never stepped onto a base or saluted a flag. The public saw the cost of policy in human detail and recognized the system's failures not as abstractions, but as losses with names and faces. In border towns, deported veterans' families held candlelight vigils. Photos of fathers, brothers, and spouses glowed in the dark, proof that service had not protected them from bureaucratic abandonment. Support houses in Mexico and Central America reported a sudden influx of calls from lawyers, journalists, and volunteers offering help. Meanwhile, the president's political base fractured. Some dismissed the town hall as another attack. Others, particularly veterans who had defended him through every controversy, felt betrayed. Online forums that once echoed unwavering loyalty now carried posts filled with questions, doubts, and anger. It wasn't Crockett who had broken their trust. It was the documents. As the backlash intensified, the president's public schedule evaporated. Planned rallies were quietly postponed. Staff struggled to craft messaging that didn't contradict the evidence on screen. The silence from the Oval Office, once strategic, now felt defensive. In a matter of days, the most powerful figure in the country appeared smaller, less because of the confrontation itself, and more because the machinery surrounding him had begun to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. As the third day dawned, the country stood in a tension it could feel but not yet name. The town hall had not simply embarrassed a president, it had pierced the membrane that usually protects institutions from the full force of public scrutiny. What followed was neither chaos nor order, but a strange, electric in-between where everything felt suspended and inevitable at once. The first consequence fell before sunrise. The VA secretary issued a statement announcing a temporary leave of absence. Reporters quickly learned it was not voluntary. A cascade of internal emails revealed that senior officials feared a wave of resignations inside the agency unless leadership publicly acknowledged its failures. The secretary's removal bought them time, but not trust. Then came ICE. Legal organizations filed emergency injunctions demanding audits of detention conditions. Judges, already inundated with asylum cases, now faced petitions referencing Crockett's evidence and the whistleblower memos. Appeals courts questioned whether detainees had been held under unconstitutional conditions. The agency attempted to downplay the crisis, but the internal data Crockett exposed had become a legal liability too large to bury. Congress shifted next. What began as a handful of hearings expanded into a full bipartisan inquiry. Lawmakers requested sworn testimony from VA directors, ICE supervisors, and senior administration officials. Committees demanded access to the restructuring plan, the backlog manipulation strategy, and all communications related to performance targets. No one expected compliance. Everyone anticipated a fight. But the political oxygen had already changed. Public sentiment was not ideological, it was moral. Veterans groups stood united, their statements clear and unflinching. Military families flooded congressional offices with letters, photos, and stories. Nonprofit organizations mobilized volunteers for the first time in years. The outrage had shape, momentum, and direction. As the pressure intensified, the president's attempt to regain control faltered. A planned address was scrapped after internal polling showed that no scripted message could counter the visual power of Crockett's evidence, or the deafening echo of his 47 seconds of silence. Advisors floated a series of strategies, from attack ads to national tours, but none could counter the starkness of the narrative now dominating the national conscience. Loyalists urged defiance, strategists urged restraint, lawyers urged silence. The result was paralysis. Meanwhile, the country moved without him. Veterans' hospitals began implementing protocol changes initiated by staff rather than leadership. Doctors reinstated treatments previously suspended. Caseworkers reopened claims that had been quietly denied. Volunteers arrived by the hundreds to support overburdened clinics. Communities filled gaps the government had carved open. At the border, a symbolic shift unfolded. Families of deported veterans stood at crossings holding photographs and service records. News crews followed them. Their stories, once overlooked, became central to a growing movement demanding that military service be recognized not only in burial but in life. One by one, lawmakers publicly endorsed legislation that had been considered politically impossible months earlier. Through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained steady. She did not chase cameras. She did not tour morning shows. She stayed in committee hearings, reviewing testimony, gathering affidavits, preparing legislation. Her name became a rallying point not because of rhetoric but because of consistency. She had become, to millions, the person who finally said what the country had been whispering for years: that service without dignity is not honor. And policy without humanity is not security. The shift that followed was not explosive. It was cumulative. A veteran in Arizona who had watched the town hall from his recliner wrote to his representative for the first time in his life. A Marine family in North Carolina organized a fundraiser for deported veterans. A former ICE officer released a sworn statement documenting internal quotas. A VA oncologist published a public letter explaining how many patients he could now treat because the backlash had forced his hospital to restore its trials. It was not a revolution. It was a realignment. A country choosing, piece by piece, to redefine what it considered unacceptable. As the week closed, the nation found itself at a crossroads. One path led toward denial, blame shifting, and the familiar cycle of political amnesia. The other led toward accountability, reform, and a long-delayed reckoning with how veterans and immigrants had been treated by the institutions meant to protect them. For once, Americans did not wait for politicians to decide. They began moving on their own. In living rooms, in clinics, in border towns, in congressional offices, in veterans' halls, people were choosing the second path. And somewhere in the middle of that shift, the silence from the town hall still echoed, not as a humiliation, but as a turning point, an audible moment when a nation confronted its failures and began, finally, to demand better.